What is it about the vampire that simply refuses to die? Centuries of folklore, hundreds of films, and the creature of the night is still walking among us, still filling seats, still making us check the locks before bed. The vampire is not just a monster, it is a mirror, reflecting our fear of death, our hunger for power, our deeply complicated relationship with desire and control. Hi, this is Movie Blanket Club. Today we are counting down the top 20 best vampire movies of all time. From silent era nightmare fuel to modern masterpieces that reimagine the entire genre. These are the films that proved the vampire is cinema's most enduring predator. Fair warning, some of these will make you want to sleep with the lights on. 20. Cronos, 1993. Guillermo del Toro's feature debut, and the man arrived fully formed, strange, tactile, and completely obsessed with the beautiful grotesque. The film centers on a Mexican antique dealer named Jesus Gris, played by Federico Lupi, who discovers a mysterious golden device hidden inside an old statue. The device, built by a 16th century alchemist, grants immortality through an intimate and unpleasant process. A mechanical insect burrows into the skin and feeds on blood. Ron Perlman shows up as the Muscle, playing a dying industrialist's nephew, with his usual combination of low-grade menace and surprising comic timing. The film is small and intimate, in a way Del Toro rarely managed again at this scale. Not a criticism, simply an observation. What makes Cronos extraordinary is its refusal to glamorize what it depicts. There are no capes here, no castle on a hill. Vampirism arrives as addiction, as physical degradation, as something deeply humiliating to the person experiencing it. The horror is 19. A Girl Walks Home. Alone at Night, 2014. Anna Lilia Mirpour shot this film in black and white in California with a cast speaking Farsi and called it the first Iranian vampire western. That sentence alone should tell you everything you need to know about the kind of film you're in for. Set in the fictional ghost town of Bad City, a place of oil derricks, stray cats, and men who do terrible things to women, the film follows a nameless vampire girl, played by Sheila Vand, who stalks the streets on a skateboard, wearing a chador that billows behind her like a cape. She preys on men who deserve it, which sounds like a simple premise until the film complicates it with a strange, delicate romance between the girl and a young man named Arash. The film is slow, deliberately so. It is more mood than plot. Some viewers will find this patience rewarding. Others will find it tedious. Both responses are honest. What Amirpour achieves here is a genuinely new visual language for the vampire film. Feminist, melancholy, and quietly furious in a way that lingers long. 18. Shadow of the Vampire, 2000. What if Max Schreck, the actor who played Count Orlok in Nosferatu, was actually a vampire? That is the premise. It is deranged. It is completely wonderful. John Malkovich plays F.W. Murnau, the director of the original Nosferatu, as a monomaniacal auteur, so consumed by his vision that he has hired a genuine vampire, played by Willem Dafoe, to star in his film, in exchange for the privilege of eventually feeding on the leading actress. Dafoe received an Academy Award nomination for this performance, and it is not hard to understand why. He is simultaneously terrifying, pathetic, hungry, and unexpectedly funny, particularly in a scene where the crew attempts to make polite conversation with a being that has not spoken to another human in over a century. The film works on multiple levels, as horror, as dark comedy, and as a quietly serious meditation on the relationship between art and exploitation. Murnau sells people to a monster to make his masterpiece. The film asks, very calmly, whether that makes him worse than the monster, or simply a different kind of one. 17. Byzantium, 2012. Neil Jordan has been here before. He made Interview with the Vampire in 1994, and his return to the genre nearly 2 decades later is quieter, stranger, and in certain ways, more affecting. The film follows two vampire women, Clara, played by Gemma Arterton, and her daughter Eleanor, played by Saoirse Ronan, who have been on the run for 200 years. Clara is fierce, pragmatic, and ruthless. Eleanor is melancholy and haunted, compelled to confess her true history to strangers in writing. They end up in a decaying British seaside town, which Jordan photographs with characteristic atmosphere. Arterton is particularly striking, bringing a dangerous vitality to Clara that lesser filmmaking would have reduced to simple villainy. Ronan does what Ronan always does. She makes you feel the full weight of a character's interior life without ever seeming to try. The film loses some momentum in its second act, and the male characters exist largely to be used or menaced. But as a meditation on survival, memory, and the true cost of immortality, Byzantium earns its place with quiet confidence. 16. Salem's Lot, 1979. Tobe Hooper adapting Stephen King should be a guaranteed triumph, and for the most part, it is. Originally broadcast as a two-part television miniseries, Salem's Lot follows writer Ben Mears, played by David Soul, who returns to his childhood home of Jerusalem's Lot, Maine, only to discover that something ancient has taken up residence in the Marston house overlooking the town. That something is Barlow, a vampire of the old school, with no charm, no conversation, no romantic pretensions whatsoever. Played by Reggie Nalder as a nearly silent creature of pure malice, modeled closely on Nosferatu's Orlok, Barlow's lack of dialogue turns out to be one of the most effective choices the production makes. The image of a pale child floating outside a second-story window at night is one of horror cinema's genuinely indelible moments, reproduced and referenced ever since, and still not exhausted. Yes, this is a television production, and the budget shows in places. But Hooper understood that suggestion and dread are considerably cheaper than special effects and considerably more frightening. Salem's Lot holds up. 15. The Hunger, 1983. Tony Scott's feature debut is the most stylistically reckless film on this list, and that is meant entirely as a compliment. Miriam Blaylock, played by Catherine Deneuve, because who else is an ancient vampire who has offered immortality to her human lovers across the centuries. The problem is that the immortality comes with an expiration date. John, her current companion, played by David Bowie, begins aging at catastrophic speed. Bowie was one of the most physically striking human beings alive at this point, which makes watching the makeup department dismantle him over the course of a single afternoon genuinely disturbing. Susan Sarandon plays a gerontologist whose research draws Miriam's attention, and their subsequent encounter is one of the most discussed scenes of 1980s cinema. The film is frequently criticized for privileging style over substance, and the criticism is fair. The Hunger is all surface. Gorgeous, cold, deliberate surface. But sometimes surface is enough. Scott shoots every frame as though it is a fashion editorial for the end of the world, and there is something hypnotic about that commitment, even when the plot underneath refuses to fully hold together. 14. Fright Night, 1985. Tom Holland's film has one of the great high-concept premises of 1980s horror. A teenage boy suspects his handsome new neighbor is a vampire and cannot convince a single adult to believe him. The neighbor is Jerry Dandridge, played by Chris Sarandon, who brings to the role exactly the right combination of surface charm and bottomless menace. The boy is Charlie Brewster, played by William Ragsdale, who is mostly trying not to die. The solution Charlie arrives at, recruiting a faded horror television host named Peter Vincent, played by Roddy McDowall, gives the film its emotional core. McDowall is magnificent, playing a man who has spent his entire career pretending to be brave and must now decide whether to actually become so. Fright Night understands something the more po-faced vampire films miss entirely. The genre is inherently a little bit funny, and the comedy makes the horror land harder rather than softer. It is also, quietly, a film about what neighbors owe each other, and how thoroughly we have learned not to ask. If you have somehow not seen this one, the gap in your horror education should embarrass. 13. Bram Stoker's Dracula, 1992. Francis Ford Coppola's adaptation of the original novel is one of the most visually extravagant films ever made, and the fact that it is also a bit of a mess is almost beside the point. Gary Oldman plays Dracula as a creature genuinely broken by centuries of grief, reinventing the character as a romantic tragedy rather than a simple predator. The production design is staggering. Every frame overloaded with gothic detail, practical effects, and a color palette that suggests German expressionism filtered through fever. Winona Ryder plays Mina. Anthony Hopkins plays Van Helsing as a man operating somewhere between genius and lunacy. Keanu Reeves plays Jonathan Harker, with an accent that remains one of cinema's great unsolved mysteries. The honest truth is that Reeves is not good here, and the film's romantic logic requires you to believe in his appeal, which creates structural problems. But Oldman is so committed, so genuinely tragic, that he pulls you through every gap. The film is operatic, excessive, and frequently ridiculous. It is also, in its best moments, exactly what a vampire film should be. A love story that was always going to end in blood. 12. 30 Days of Night, 2007. David Slade's adaptation of the Steve Niles graphic novel does something simple and effective. It takes the basic rules of vampire mythology and asks what happens in a place where the sun does not rise for a month. The answer is nothing good. The town of Barrow, Alaska, the northernmost town in the United States, a full month of polar night, becomes an ideal hunting ground. Josh Hartnett plays the local sheriff. Melissa George plays his estranged wife, trapped in town when the vampires arrive and begin systematically eliminating everyone. Led by Danny Houston, almost unrecognizable under the makeup, these vampires are genuinely new creatures. Feral, communicative in a language of their own, and stripped of every trace of courtly charm. They are predators in the purest sense. The script is thin, and Hartnett and George are asked to carry more emotional weight than the film quite earns for them. But Slade films the carnage with a cold, wide-angle efficiency that makes it feel genuinely dangerous. The aerial shot over a snow-covered town running red is an image the film earns completely. This is how you build a monster from scratch. 11. From Dusk Till Dawn, 1996. Robert Rodriguez directs, Quentin Tarantino writes and co-stars, and the result is exactly as deranged as that combination implies. The first half is a crime film. Two brothers, Seth Gecko, played by George Clooney at his most purely magnetic, and Richie, played by Tarantino, unhinged and deeply unpleasant, kidnap a family and force them to drive across the Mexican border. The second half is pure survival horror, as the group holes up in a roadside strip club called the Titty Twister, which turns out to be staffed entirely by vampires. The genre pivot is one of cinema's great bait and switches. You're watching one film, and then suddenly you're watching a completely different film, and somehow both of them work. Clooney is the reason the first half functions as more than setup. He makes Seth genuinely compelling, even frightening, before the vampire show starts. The film is excessive by design, gory by preference, and funny in a way that horror comedies frequently aspire to and rarely achieve. It will not change your life. It will make you considerably more careful about roadside stops. 10. What We Do in the Shadows, 2014. We have reached the top 10, and there is room here for exactly one vampire comedy, so it had better be the best one. It is. Taika Waititi and Jermaine Clement's mockumentary follows four vampire flatmates in Wellington, New Zealand, aged between 100 and 8,000 years, as they navigate flat meetings, nightclub dress codes, and the challenges of going out when you cannot be photographed and cannot see yourself in mirrors. The joke is simple. The execution is immaculate. Waititi plays Viago, a hopeless romantic still carrying a torch for a woman he loved in the 1800s. Clement plays Vladislav, a once powerful vampire now diminished, primarily by the humiliation of losing a confrontation with a rival he refers to only as the Beast. The film earns genuine laughs and, unexpectedly, genuine feeling. The final act lands an emotional note that a straight horror film would struggle to achieve. What We Do in the Shadows loves the genre it is dismantling. The affection comes through in every frame, and it makes the comedy work harder than it has any right to. 9. Horror of Dracula, 1958. Terence Fisher's Hammer. Horror adaptation arrived in vivid Technicolor, and the shock of that color, blood that was actually red, not gray, was half the point. Peter Cushing plays Van Helsing with precise, methodical intelligence, bringing to the role a scientist's discipline that makes him one of the most credible vampire hunters in cinema history. Christopher Lee plays Dracula, and his performance is one of the most physically imposing in the entire genre. Lee was 6'4", moved with extraordinary deliberateness, and chose to largely underplay, to let the size and stillness do the work. He has perhaps a dozen lines in the entire film. He does not need more. Hammer's version dispensed with much of the source novel's complexity and replaced it with directness. Here is the vampire, here is the hunter, here is the confrontation. Critics who wanted psychological depth looked elsewhere. Everyone else got one of the most efficiently thrilling horror films of the 20th century. The final confrontation, in which Van Helsing forms a cross from candlesticks and drives Dracula into the sunlight, remains genuinely electrifying staging. Hammer never quite topped it. 8. Blade, 1998. Before the MCU, before the modern superhero era had properly begun, Stephen Norrington's Blade arrived and demonstrated that a comic book adaptation could be genuinely stylish, genuinely violent, and genuinely cool. Wesley Snipes plays the Daywalker, half human, half vampire, with the strengths of both species and, we are told, the thirst. The film opens with a vampire rave in a meatpacking plant, the ceiling raining blood onto an ecstatic crowd, and establishes its register immediately. This is a film that has made its choices and is entirely comfortable with them. Chris Christopherson plays Blade's mentor Whistler with the kind of weathered authenticity that makes you believe in the world around him. Stephen Dorff plays villain Deacon Frost with a petulant energy that becomes more entertaining the longer you watch it. Blade is not a deep film. The plot is essentially a procedural, and the emotional beats are competent rather than remarkable. But Snipes is so fully committed to every frame, the physicality, the contained fury, the dry humor, that the film earns considerably more than its script deserves. Without Blade, there is no modern superhero cinema. That is not a small thing to have done. 7. Near Dark, 1987. Kathryn Bigelow's genre exercise is the coolest film on this list, and the one most likely to genuinely surprise viewers who have not yet encountered it. Set in the American Midwest, the film follows a young farm worker named Caleb, played by Adrian Pasdar, who is turned by a beautiful drifter named May, played by Jenny Wright, and must travel with her vampire family in a modified RV that keeps out the sunlight. The family is led by Jesse, played by Lance Henriksen, and includes Bill Paxton as Severin, one of the great unhinged supporting performances of 1980s cinema. Paxton plays Severin as pure accelerant, cheerful about violence, impossible to predict, and operating on a frequency that makes every scene he is in slightly dangerous. The film never once uses the word vampire. It does not need to. Bigelow strips the mythology back to its essentials: the need for blood, the vulnerability to sunlight, the inability to age, and places them against the flat, bleached landscape of the American Southwest with an almost documentary matter-of-factness. Near Dark failed on release and has spent 3 decades becoming exactly the cult classic it always deserved to be. 6. The Lost Boys, 1987. Joel Schumacher's film is the vampire movie that a generation of teenagers watched in the 80s and never fully recovered from. Michael and Sam, played by Jason Patric and Corey Haim, move with their divorced mother to Santa Carla, the murder capital of the world, according to a passing newspaper headline. And Michael is seduced into a gang of young vampires, led by Kiefer Sutherland, who delivers one of his most perfectly calibrated performances. Dangerous, charismatic, and just camp enough to be irresistible. The film is extraordinarily good-looking, shot with a sensibility that treats the California night as something both beautiful and genuinely threatening. Its visual language, caves, motorcycles, comic books, rock music, wrote the template for cool teenage horror that was still being imitated 2 decades later. The Frog Brothers are comedic in a way that does not always land, and the final act leans heavily on spectacle at the expense of tension. But Sutherland is so compelling that the film never needs to justify itself. The Lost Boys defines its genre not by being the best example of 5. Dracula, 1931. Todd Browning's Universal Pictures adaptation is the film that created the template every vampire film that followed has either used or rejected. Bela Lugosi plays the Count, and it is Lugosi who invented the character as popular culture understands it. Not Stoker, not the stage productions that preceded this film. The accent, the cape, the deliberate hypnotic gaze. All of it originated here, in a film shot largely as a filmed stage play, with stationary cameras and theatrical lighting that should by rights feel ancient and exhausted by now. It does not. Lugosi's performance is strange and specific enough to remain genuinely unsettling nearly a century later. There is something not quite right about the rhythms of his speech, something in the pauses between words that suggests a mind operating on a timeline entirely different from the humans around him. Dwight Fry, as the doomed Renfield, provides the film's most kinetic energy. His transformation from eager solicitor to crawling madman is still disturbing. The production is creaky by modern standards, and the pacing slow even by the standards of its era. But without Dracula, 1931, there is no vampire cinema. That is not a small thing to be. 4. Interview with the Vampire, 1994. Neil Jordan's adaptation of Anne Rice's novel gave us two things simultaneously. Tom Cruise doing the most unexpected work of his early career, and Brad Pitt spending 2 hours being the most beautifully miserable creature in the history of supernatural cinema. Louis de Pointe-du-Lac, Pitt's vampire, is the story's moral center. A man turned against his will who spends 2 centuries torturing himself with guilt over what he has become. Cruise plays Lestat de Lioncourt as a being of pure appetite who finds Louis's conscience genuinely baffling and occasionally hilarious. The chemistry between them is the film's engine. Anne Rice famously objected to the casting before she saw the rushes, then publicly reversed her position in an open letter after the fact. Kirsten Dunst, as the child vampire Claudia, gives a performance that would be remarkable coming from an adult. Coming from a 12-year-old, it is extraordinary. Cruise understood instinctively that Lestat is not a villain and not a hero, but something rarer, a creature so fully committed to its own nature that moral judgment simply ceases to apply. He has never been better. 3. Only Lovers. Left Alive, 2013. Jim Jarmusch's film is the quietest entry on this list by some distance, and also one of the most purely pleasurable. Adam and Eve, played by Tom Hiddleston and Tilda Swinton, are vampires, and married, and have been on and off for centuries. They are intellectuals, aesthetes, consumers of music and literature and blood, which they source carefully and treat as a controlled substance, rather than a license to kill. The film is structured almost entirely around their reunion, Adam in Detroit, Eve in Tangier, and what follows is less plot than atmosphere. 2 ancient beings navigating the early 21st century with equal parts affection and exhaustion. Hiddleston plays Adam as a musician submerged in melancholy. Surrounded by vintage instruments, he plays alone in an empty house. Swinton plays Eve as someone who has made a longer peace with time and finds her husband's despondency both understandable and faintly exasperating. There is no real villain, no real threat, no real climax. Jarmusch trusts that the company of these 2 characters is sufficient reason to watch. For a certain kind of viewer, it absolutely is. Only Lovers Left Alive is a film for anyone who has ever felt slightly out of place in the century they were born into. 2. Nosferatu, 1922. F. W. Murnau's unauthorized adaptation of Stoker's novel, made without the author's estate's permission, which led to a lawsuit demanding all prints be destroyed, is one of the foundational documents of cinema itself, and it remains genuinely disturbing in a way that 100-year-old films almost never manage. Count Orlok, played by Max Schreck, is the anti-Lugosi in every respect. Nothing seductive, nothing aristocratic, nothing remotely glamorous about him. He is rodent-like, shadow-like, wrong in a way that is difficult to articulate, but impossible to dismiss. The film's most famous image, Orlok's shadow on the staircase, elongated and wrong, climbing toward the sleeping woman, has been reproduced so many times that it is almost impossible to see it fresh. But in the film itself, in context, it remains profoundly unnerving. Murnau understood that the camera does not need to show you everything. The shadow implies the creature. The creature implies the ending. The ending is inevitable and unwatchable. Nosferatu is not technically a perfect film by any modern measure. The intertitles interrupt the rhythm. The pacing is uneven. None of that matters. Some images are powerful enough to outlast the films that contain them. 1. Let the Right One In, 2008. Thomas Alfredson's Swedish adaptation of John Ajvide Lindqvist's novel does something no other film on this list attempts. It places the vampire myth at the exact center of a story about loneliness and asks whether the monster beside you and the lonely child beside you are actually that different from each other. Oscar, played by Cora Hedebrandt, is 12 years old, pale, isolated, and bullied with methodical cruelty. Eli, played by Lena Leanderson, moves in next door and is approximately 12 years old, and has been for a very long time. Their relationship develops slowly, carefully, with the halting intimacy that children use when they are not yet sure how trust is supposed to work. The film is set in a Swedish suburb in winter, all concrete, sodium light, and frozen ground, and Alfredson treats the setting as emotional weather. The cold is not picturesque. It is the condition of the lives being lived in it. The violence, when it comes, is sudden and presented without pleasure. There is a sequence in a swimming pool near the end that is one of the most perfectly constructed scenes in 21st century horror cinema. Let the Right One In is the greatest vampire film ever made, because it understands what the best films on this list have always known. The vampire story was never really about blood. It was always about who you let in. And there you have it, the top 20 best vampire movies of all time. From Guillermo del Toro's strange golden device in Cronos to the frozen suburb and the swimming pool of Let the Right One In. From the blood-soaked carnival of From Dusk Till Dawn to the delicate, exhausted love of Only Lovers Left Alive. What the best vampire films have always understood is this: the creature is a mirror. It reflects whatever fear or desire the era needs to examine. Sexuality, mortality, the terror of aging, the cost of never aging at all. The vampire survives because the questions it asks do not have answers. This is Movie Blanket Club.